My name is Denise, and I used to work at Arts Council England. I now run an organisation called Freedom in the Arts, which promotes freedom of expression uh, in the art world. And I won a tribunal, an employment tribunal against my employer, Arts Council England, for the right to speak freely and state clearly that a man cannot be a woman. I was thinking about it this morning about like life before I found out about this, and it was such a long time ago now, but it's been such a tipping point in my life, and I know it has been for so many women. When I think when I think of you doing this project, and people's lives have changed reacting to this massively. Um, but I guess it would have been probably sort of 2019ish, quite late, really. Um, and yeah, I guess I mean it really sort of started at work, and um, one of my colleagues, we were in a team meeting, and one of my colleagues suggested that we should all start putting pronouns in our signatures and things, and I honestly had no idea why or what it was about, and I thought it was a bit silly, and then and most of the people in the team didn't know what she was talking about either, really. So it was all a bit vague. And then I started looking it up, and but somebody in the meeting said that they'd felt they'd been othered, and I didn't really understand what that meant either, other than it didn't sound very nice, you know. But, but I didn't really understand it. So I started kind of looking at it, and then I started looking at what training. I was a union representative. I was thinking, oh, well, maybe we need some training. So I started looking at what training we could get, and people started telling me the types of training I should look for. So the main trainer that people were recommending was Gendered Intelligence, and also the Proud Trust in Manchester. Anyway, I started reading through their training, and I began thinking, what? Like, it was recommending things like I have to go into every meeting that I had. And at that time in my workplace, I had external meetings all the time. And I'd have to ask people what pronouns they were using, as in what gender they were. And that was the first time I'd come across it. And I just thought, how ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. That's completely ridiculous. And it's I know what gender they are. I can just look at them. you know? um, So I sort of couldn't quite understand it, but I went along with it because I didn't want to offend my colleagues. I had nice colleagues, sort of quite gentle people, and friends essentially. But the more I looked at it, the more crazy it seemed to me, and I just couldn't imagine a real world where it was applied, where anybody kind of really took on board the idea that um, that people could change sex. And I also felt vaguely offended at kind of the rejection of feminism. I think that's probably my first kind of um, uh, instinct. That was my instinctual response, was that women who I thought gay um, were rejecting being female as a sort of, and I thought, why would you do that? Is it really empowering to be female? I'm proud of being female, and all everything that we'd achieved, as women and as feminism. So that, I think that was my first response. Was was Once I started to read up on what the issues were, was the sense that my female colleagues were trying to reject being female, and they were a bit younger. They were, yeah, I guess they were younger. But yeah, I think I felt offended by that. Anyway, from there, unfortunately, I just started to fall down the rabbit hole. And the person that I was reading the most was, I can never pronounce her surname, but Maria McLaughlin, is it? Do you know her? And her website, Peak Trans. And some of the ridiculous scenarios that would come out of something which sounded so simple and pleasant. So I read about that bloke, Jessica Yaniv, in Canada, and the way he'd sued beauticians for not, waxing his balls when they were like a female only place. And that he'd won. He'd won that case. He'd taken them to court. And so her website was kind of my route in, really. And I felt more and more kind of, this is not good. This is kind of it's just a license to be pretty rotten to people, to women. So yeah, that's how it all started, and it really felt like it was an obsession to begin with, because I was learning more and more about it. And I'm sure that people call it, don't they, being peaked. It's that process of realizing that something really crazy is happening, and that it has such profound implications for every bit of society, and for families, for health, for mental health, for workspaces, for privacy, for every area. And also for kind of truth. What is real? Is there an objective truth? Does science exist anymore? It's like, so it started to just touch everything. And I know lots of women have that experience, don't they, where they just suddenly start seeing the world in a completely different lens if you take on board this idea that you can entirely change reality. If you say that you want to entirely change reality, you can just be something else. So that's how it started. I began to speak to other women, like just slowly, kind of, oh, what do you think of this? And then I went on. So this was colleagues at work. So there's a couple of us that started to go, what's going on? And then I went on Twitter, which I hadn't really done before. And I started to follow accounts and started to read stuff, And then one day I was off work, and I was wandering around in town, and I was followed by this guy that had his dick out, and I thought, God, but at the same time, I was still on Twitter, because I was still looking at Twitter, and whilst getting away from this guy, I did a tweet, and I responded to one of those. Responded to a tweet about a period app that I had on my phone that would tell you when you were going to have your periods. I mean, I never really used it, but I had it on my phone, and the company had decided to not advertise to women, but to everyone, women and men, because of course men can have periods as too. And I thought this was so ridiculous that whilst being followed by this bloke, I deleted the app, and I tweeted, app deleted, and then I wandered off. I mean, it was a work day, but I wasn't in work that day. And by the time I'd got from the centre of town to Sainsbury's, I'd started to get loads of people responding to that, and I started to get all these notifications. And then somebody, and I think I had where I worked in my bio, and then somebody said she should be sacked. And then there was a complaint put in, and there was an internal complaint put in about me. And by the time I got to Sainsbury's, HR had rung me and said, it's up to you, but we think you should delete that. You know, something's kicking off. No, there was a bit of a conversation going on in Twitter about this ridiculous app, and so I just put app deleted, because I was offended. You know, men don't get periods, and I don't know. Anyway, and I was also pissed off because I was getting followed by a bloke with his dick out. You know, the reality of being female, in other words, is blatantly obvious. And it was in that moment. Anyway, so then my boss rang and said, look, comms is getting loads of hassle, and could you just delete that tweet? And I said, oh. In the end, I said yes, okay, because I didn't want my colleagues to get hassled over something so stupid. So I deleted it, but then I was just so angry, and I still kept getting this pile on of, you know, I worked at the Arts Council. There's a transphobe at the Arts Council. It went on and on, this stupid thing going. And so that was a bit of a moment for me where I thought, hang on, this is crazy, because this isn't a discussion about anybody's rights, or this is just like hassling me. I'm allowed to delete apps, you know, and I'm allowed to delete them because I don't agree with them. That's all legal in this country. Should I lose a job for it? And then I found out that somebody internally had made a complaint about me for this silly tweet, you know. Anyway, so I was very wound up by that, and obviously I got more and more and more involved. And I was disturbed, really, that something, well, one, at that level of bullying, or it wasn't quite bullying, I suppose, but it was harassment. It was online pylon. That could be triggered so easily on this subject, on disagreement on this subject, and also that this wasn't a discussion, or it was just aggression. There was no well, let's talk about how we can sort this out between men, women, and people that don't feel they're either. You know, it's not a kind of like, well, how can we make this work? You know. So I thought, well, obviously I can make this work. There is a way forward. You know, there is a third way. And you know, the third way is gender neutral toilets, stuff like that. You know, there's ways we can make this work without all falling out, and that's where I was at that point. But I did start to look at where I worked. We collected a lot of data, utterly pointlessly actually. But I started to look at why we were what the data was we were collecting in a bit more detail, and realised that data had all changed, so that the word woman also included the word trans woman. And I thought, well, a trans woman is a trans woman, but they're not a woman. You know, that's partly why they've got that adjective on the front. You know, that there's somebody that identifies as woman, they're a man that identifies as woman, but they're not a woman. They don't have the same issues of discrimination that women experience. And that's, for me, is the only reason to collect data, is to check that we're not discriminating against women or other groups. But you won't be able to do that if you put both of those groups together. You can't track discrimination anymore. You can't do things like gender pay gap anymore, or that all falls apart. So data collection was another part where I thought, well, you know, that's clearly a problem. And so I raised it with my chief exec and others, like, how has this happened that we now don't recognise biological sex in our data? And the Arts Council where I worked is a big grant giver, so it collects a lot of data, and it collects data on the people it funds, um, the the organisations and their staff, the audiences of the people that go to those organisations, the volunteers, the children. So that's a lot of data. That's a lot of people being counted. It's in its millions, and all of it is wrong. You know, and also when I looked at it, they were all doing it in completely different ways. So but the counting people that identified as trans was completely mixed up. Uh, anyway, it was a mess. Uh, and I sort of said, when did all this start happening? And of course it started sort of. The Arts Council was a Stonewall in the Stonewall Index in 2013, and it came in at that. I think it came in around then, 2015ish, and then the Arts Council left the index because it took too long, and they thought it was a bit of a waste of time. They still bought the badge thing, but they didn't do the index anymore. But one of the consequences of that was that the data had been completely mashed up to bring in self-identification, and I was incensed by that because I thought, well, we don't have self-identification in this country. It, this doesn't reflect the Equality Act. This somebody's just made this up. And that again was a bit of a shock to me, that an institution can just be. You could just make stuff up, and it starts getting introduced as if it's real or as if it's law, and it isn't. And I've been in my job for a long time, and I had a lot of respect for the organisation itself. I mean, it was a great place to work, and I felt a bit kind of like a bit let down. So I started to sort of raise this because there was a change in schemes, and this also the risk was that staff weren't monitored in this way. Staff were called male and female, or men and women, or something like that. I think there was a question about non-binary or something, but they weren't all. Trans wasn't part of staff data, but it was part of funded organisations data. So I was like, this is just mad. It doesn't, the data collection wasn't even across the whole thing. It was all over the place. So, and there was a push to change the staff data collection, and I thought that would be a disaster. That is not. I don't want to work in an organisation that doesn't recognise I'm female. I'm not prepared to do that. And so I started trying to get in and deal with this data issue. And my organisation were just like, they didn't really want to get involved. They knew it was a hot potato, and by that point, I knew I was getting in deeper with it. And then I started kind of looking at what was going on. I mean, I was in a bit of an ivory tower. I had a decent job, and I worked in the arts, and I had a full-time contract, and I had a pension, and you know what it's like in the arts. Most people are not as safely employed as I was. And I started reading about an artist that had just been absolutely harassed for her opinions, and I'd lost a job at a university, and I'd heard about various artists that were in this position. Um, and I thought, God, it must be tough out there. I was quite protected. Um, and I went to an artist studio opening, and I think uh, basically she was getting pushed out of the studio, um, and in the so it was an open studio with visitors come to see it at the weekend. Everybody put exhibitions on their studio spaces. A lot of people had put trans flags around her, so she was kind of surrounded by progress flags, and she was being evicted. Um, and she'd fought back a little bit, and she'd got the help of Peter Daly, the solicitor, to do a letter to the studio to tell them that they were discriminating against her. But she decided to leave anyway. And the atmosphere was absolutely horrendous, and I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe seeing her surrounded by these flags, and she was so beleaguered. And I just was appalled by it. And after that, I thought, oh, I can't let this drop. I can't. This is just awful. What's actually happening to women in the arts? But even, I mean, I knew of the men that they'd experienced a similar thing as a result of this mad ideology that was helping people to bully each other. You know, so I put a call out on Twitter, and I asked for case studies, and I got sent about 14 or 15 case studies, and I took them to my chief exec at Arts Council England. And some of the stories were horrendous. One woman had a house vandalised, had moved out to get away from the atmosphere. It was just horrendous. And some of the bullying had come from arts organisations that were being funded by lottery players and British taxpayers. You know, it come through the public purse, and I was so furious. You can hear it even now. And I realised, God, I've got I'm in a position of authority here. You know, I can do something about this. I've got to do something about this, or at least to raise the issue of the bullying. Really, that's what I was most offended by. Was listen, we can have different opinions, but you can't bully people. You know, and I still basically think that, you know, even though I don't think there's much of a third way anymore, I do think that we've got to live and let live, as we always did with all of those other opinions that we don't agree with each other on. Anyway, again, I took it to chief exec and head of diversity, and they ummed and ahed about it. And then Rosie Kay I got in touch with Rosie Kay when I saw what was happening to her company. So she'd been basically lambasted by her freelance staff, accused of transphobia. Her board hadn't defended her, and essentially the company then collapsed. She had to resign. She was the chief artistic director. She'd founded the company, and the company collapsed. And again, that she was publicly funded. She was a regularly funded arts organisation with the Arts Council. So that was just taxpayers' money just thrown down the drain for what was a perfectly, you know, an award-winning internationally touring company destroyed because of a difference of opinion. You know, it's just crazy. Anyway, so I was quite, because I was a sort of civil servant, I felt quite strongly about that public funding was being used to bully people, to trash public funding. It was silly. So I realised the atmosphere was getting really bad. I kept saying we've got a duty of responsibility at the Arts Council to do something about this bullying in the sector. We've got to kind of say, well, in some shape or form, we've got to do something about this, because, you know, it's not a healthy place for anyone to work, and we shouldn't be funding bullies. After that, LGB Alliance got a grant, and I think the people might know about this because it was in the press, and they got a very small grant of about £9,000, and by this time we'd when was that? We'd got through COVID, and you'll remember that everybody was working at home, and during the COVID years at the Arts Council, I mean, it was strange for everyone, but it was quite a busy period because we did a lot of funding schemes to try and stop the sector collapsing. But obviously everybody was in these weird team meetings, hundreds of people in team meetings. George Floyd was murdered. The atmosphere became very febrile. It was quite difficult. And I think professional conduct at work got pretty flaky, and there was a lot of politics swimming around that essentially had nothing to do with the workplace. You know, and and whether that's working at home, whether that's everything that happened during that period, I think, made the workplace quite febrile, I think. So by the time LGB Alliance put in a grant for it was the grant was made by a devolved organisation, so it wasn't made directly by the Arts Council, but it was Arts Council funding that was distributed to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee. What was it called? I can't remember what it was called now, but it wasn't called Queenie, even though it should have been. anyway, it went through London Community Foundation, and they got a grant for £9,000 to make a short film about the impact of gay men during the Queen's reign. So basically post-war to now, and how they've changed the country, and it was a nice idea. It was a celebration of gay men's and elderly gay men's contribution to the country, and so they got the grant, and it immediately got piled on Twitter again. And in fact, the grant manager got personally attacked on Twitter as well. And then the Arts Council got some flack because it was the original funder. And then my colleagues started all doing on the staff intranet that they shouldn't be funded. They're a hate group. And I just thought, oh God. And then the chief exec was on holiday, I think, but the deputy chief exec called a staff meeting, and I knew it was going to be horrendous. So it was all staff. So there was actually about 700 staff at the time. There was quite a lot of staff because we had all these grants to deal with because of COVID. But 400 staff came to that meeting, and this was a grant of £9,000 at a time. A year, an exceptional year for making grants, when we'd given out 1.5 billion. I'd never been to an all staff meeting about one grant. I've never been to, well, we just didn't have them. We didn't have staff meetings about it, to discuss the pros and cons of a grant. A grant is made with a group of staff, but we didn't go on afterwards and discuss it all. Anyway, that deputy director I'd actually had quite a difficult day, because prior to that meeting, I've been representing somebody as a union rep at a what's it called, capability hearing, which was pretty horrendous. So it's already it's already a difficult day. So then I went to joined this online meeting of 400 members of staff, and my deputy director went on to essentially slate LGB Alliance as being transphobic and divisive, and saying that they shouldn't be funded. And I mean, honestly, I couldn't believe it. I thought, what has happened to impartiality? So all of these things that had collapsed, the notion of women had gone, the notion of getting on with your colleagues, even if you don't agree with them, that had gone. Even the notion of impartiality around grant making, that had disappeared, but led by a deputy of the biggest arts funder in the country. All because people think that they can change sex, which they can't. So many little things have been eroded that are really central to. I think impartial institutions are central to an effective democracy. Impartial public funding. Do you not get public funding if you have a certain idea? Or how far do you get inside people's heads to assess whether or not they're okay to fund? It just crazy. Anyway, I objected to his take on that. I said they weren't transphobic. I said, how are you going to protect gender critical? I mean, I was writing this down in the chat. How are you going to protect gender critical staff? Basically, I just completely outed myself, and I already knew that there was. I'd heard, on the grapevine that I'd had whispers about me and that sort of thing. Anyway, so off I outed, and I knew there was no going back after that. It was I can even now I can feel my heart beating. Anyway, a few weeks later, a petition was launched by my colleagues, which, I mean, yeah. Anyway, so various things happened in between. I put a complaint in to DCMS, which is a Department of Culture, Media and Sport, to say that this event broke our agreement as an impartial arm's length body of government. You know, we have a legal requirement to behave with impartiality. I mean, when I say it's a legal requirement, it's not that strong a legal requirement. It's sort of an agreement, but you know, there's that I thought it was a whistleblowing claim, and it was treated as a whistleblowing claim. And I wrote to our chief exec, who not chief exec, what's he called, chairman, who's still Nicholas Sirota, who was also at that time a trustee at the BBC, and he just conducted an impartiality report for news editorial. So he'd been setting out how to do how to be impartial at the BBC. Well, we certainly weren't being at the Arts Council, which he chaired. So I put in that whistleblowing claim to DCMS, to government. But a few weeks later, my colleagues launched a petition, and 140 people signed this petition saying that transphobes shouldn't be in the organisation and that they were racists, Islamicists, not Islamicists, Islamophobes, you know, all the rest of it, everything, cultural parasite, homophobic, just, you know, horrible stuff, really. And I was really devastated by it, much more than I thought. You know, just saying it cold, but I was absolutely devastated by it. And I had worked there for 15 years. You know, I was like a mum to half of them. You know, and perhaps that's the issue. But yeah, so I mean, I remember again another little trip to Sainsbury's, and it was my daughter's 18th the next day, the day after the petition went up, and it stayed up for 30 hours. I asked HR to take it down. They tried, but they were kind of blocked by management, who didn't want to offend the LGBTQIA plus group. It didn't matter about offending me or anybody else. In the end, they took it down because they said it might have breached the IT policy. Anyway, they took it down. But I went. The next day was my daughter's 18th, and it was really difficult because I had to do the whole family event, and I was really, really trashed. I felt very, very tearful, and I'd completely lost confidence in the leadership of my organisation. I'd lost all respect for them. I just thought their behaviour was appalling, you know, at every level. I just completely lost trust. And I think I'm quite a trusting person, so that was a big deal, I think, to lose that trust in them. But around that time, another member of staff got in touch with me who I didn't know, and it turned out she'd recorded the whole meeting on her phone of the deputy manager speaking out of line with these 400 staff. And we all had all these screenshots of the chat that had gone on. So the whole meeting was then documented, and I didn't know that, but then I was able to submit that as evidence. And I mean, you know, good on HR. They never asked me whether I'd recorded it or whether somebody else. And I never revealed who recorded it. They never asked me to. So then I had the whole thing documented. So I put in a grievance, and again, I still had faith. Well, they're gonna. Well, first of all, you have that thing. Do they actually understand the issues? And you do everything to sort of show there is a difference between sex and gender. Self-identification has major ramifications. It isn't law in this country. Look at force data, you know, so presenting reams and reams of paper to say, you're out of line. You've got to, you're not within the law. I met with the investigator who was, I think he's left Arts Council now, but he was the trustee overseeing audit, and he's quite a posh gentleman, had a lot of gravitas, previously education background. He seemed to be listening. And then I got through the whole process, and he sort of said, well, I went to this terrible meeting in Nottingham and I had 3 meetings with him. So I was interviewed over about 10 hours, 11 hours. And towards the end of this meeting, I was really exhausted. And he said, well, I can see it wasn't very nice, but nobody did anything. Nobody's to blame. There's nothing really here. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like, you're joking. You could just launch petitions against people at work, and that's fine. Anyway, so I just had to take some time off of that. I was just so exhausted by it. And then in August or something like that, in the summer, I got the letter saying, no, we're not upholding your grievance. There was nothing bad happened. And I went to meet Nick Sirota, and he apologised to me, and the whole thing was minuted. He apologised for what had happened, and he said it shouldn't have happened, but I'm not going to uphold it. And I was like, well, why? Why are you not upholding it and you're actually apologising? Doesn't want to offend LGBTQIA+. So then I took them to a tribunal and I had made a submission to ACAS. I don't know if you know the process, but basically, first of all, you have to go to ACAS. It's just, to be honest, it's just a protocol. Not much happens. And then I started going through the process to go to court, and the court date was set up quite quickly in Leeds. So I submitted in September or something like that. And the date was mid-June. And I had the first court hearing in December, I think 2022. And it's really quite complicated. And I was thinking, God, how am I going to do this? So I was just representing myself. I didn't have any representation. I talked to Mayor Forstatter, and she was sort of saying, you're going to lose your job one way or another. And then I resigned in February because I just thought I just can't work here anymore. No, I didn't. I went off sick. No, I resigned in February, and then I had a 3 months notice. But I didn't serve it. I just went off sick, really. And then we had quite a lot going on, and it was quite a difficult time because we had to move house at the same time because I won't bore you with that. It was quite boring. But there's a lot to do during that period. And at some point I realised that was it. We were living between houses, and I was in an Airbnb, and I was trying to deal with this legal work. And I just realised I was out of my depth, really. And I also realised I couldn't lose the case because mine was the first one after Forstatter. And it was pretty straightforward. There was everything was minuted. It was happening quite quickly, and I couldn't lose it because if I lost it, I'd have lost for the cause. And I'd been having meetings with LGB Alliance to try and with Eileen and Kate, and eventually we thought, well, we're gonna have to pay for a solicitor. And Anya Palmer was available. Maya put us in touch, and I was also working with Liz McGlone. So I had both of them on my side, and LGB Alliance helped with that relationship to get it off the ground. And then uh, I realised I tried to get our house insurance to pay for it because we had legal cover under the house insurance. And they said I didn't have a case and I was arguably transphobic. So then I had to do them over as well. And it's one of the biggest legal insurance companies in the country. We threatened legal action against them, and in the end, they agreed to pay 30 grand towards it. But we had to threaten them. Um, and then I had to do I basically had to do the crowdfunder, and initially I opened it just to like a closed thing to pay for the merits to be done, really. And then I realised I had to make it public, and to do that, I'd have to have a press campaign. And I'd already had discussions with the press because I've done quite a lot of different things, kind of trying to build this up. I'd already talked to politicians. I'd got them to ask a question directly of our chief executive at a select committee hearing about why the LGB Alliance grant was turned down and why it wasn't investigated. DCMS refused to investigate my whistleblowing claim. I mean, I very much believe that the London Community Foundation was put under pressure to have that grant withdrawn, and I'm sure it came from Arts Council, but I'll never be able to prove that unless that case is opened up. But now I had to go public, and I talked to various people at the Arts Council at comms, told them by the end of the week I was going to make a public case. So, I tried to help my colleagues who were in the firing line, and I still work there. I felt bad about it, to be honest, but I just felt they'd got it so wrong. I couldn't let it keep going, and it wasn't just. It's not, and I'm sure it's the same for the Darlington nurses and Sandy Peggy and all these people that work in the public sector. It's not just that it affects you as a worker. It affects the service that you're delivering. It affects the integrity of your organisation. It affects the public, and so you feel a responsibility to get it back on track. Um, so anyway, so then I did the first interview for the Telegraph on the Friday, and I'd warned, and it came out on Friday, and then the crowdfunder was launched, and I started doing this round of interviews and stuff, and I mean it was awful. I felt really like it was just such a big thing to do, to sort of betray your organisation like that. I did feel like I was being treacherous, but I felt I had to be. And I also wasn't really one for the limelight, the public limelight. I was a pen pusher. That's I wasn't a performer. So it was a big learning curve. And to be honest, since then it's kind of continued to be, because we won that case. We went to court. I mean, court was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. That was a great performance. That was great. Anya was brilliant. But my chair didn't come to court. The chair of the Arts Council didn't, but the deputy did, and that was really good fun seeing him struggle, brought down essentially. But it goes on. I mean, one of the people that led the bullying, led the petition, was one of the worst offenders, left the organisation just before she was disciplined for what she'd done, and then took them to a tribunal for what's it called, unfair dismissal, and won it on the grounds that she hadn't bullied, even though my case had been won on the grounds that she had bullied. So lawfare doesn't fix everything. It's very unpredictable, as we've seen with Sandy Peggy's case, as we're seeing now with for Women Scotland. It's not being applied. It still needs this cultural change. But I started the story, like, when was it? 2019. We're in 2026. I left my job. I set up a new organisation with a woman that I barely knew, and I'd just met because her company had collapsed because of the trans lobby had destroyed her company, and we went on to set up Freedom in the Arts, which we've now been running. Well, I mean, this is our second year of trading, but it's our third year of sort of operating. And we're just about operating. We're just about working in this organisation now. Is an organisation, and we're meeting people all the time that have been bullied for really reasonable thoughts. These aren't hate thoughts. They don't meet any legal definition of hate, but they end up, especially artists, they can't speak, or they can't say anything, or they feel they're in such an oppressive environment that they're being watched, or they know they're on a blacklist, and we know there's blacklisting, you know, or they just lose their jobs, or they lose commissions. Or one of the worst things we found is that we spoke to somebody who looked back at work that he'd made 10 years ago, that he didn't think he'd be able to make that work now, not because it wouldn't be commissioned, but he wouldn't dare to think it. So people were not only self-censoring what they said, they were self-censoring even what they think as artists themselves. They were doing it to themselves. So, I mean, some of the things we hear is just absolutely crazy. So that's where I am. That's when I say, like, how much it's changed my life. It's completely changed my life. Yeah, and I mean, this isn't just the trans issue. Can men be women? No, they can't. But it's so many different issues, in which people are afraid to speak freely. But also, it made me distrust everything. Things that I trusted. Like voting Labour. I'd never do that again. I would never do that, and I'd done it my whole life. I was a Labour member, but I would never do it again. I mean, there'd have to be such a massive change, but it's really made me see, that the left and the Labour Party in this country, anyway, women's rights, it's absolutely bottom of the list. It's not even on the list, and the same with the trade unions. I've been a trade unionist my whole life. I've been a rep so many times. I'd never trust a British trade union now. I mean, I tell people to go to one that's completely apolitical, Affinity it's called, and so trust in kind of things, that I thought were kind of fundamental to democracy, I just demolished it, because they don't even believe in reality. So it's really profound. It's really, really profound. I haven't had the direct impact of some mums, where something dreadful happens to their children, or or women that have married men that become women. So I haven't had that experience. But I think it has affected relations, because I think my family see it as something small and a bit obsessive, and a bit silly. And I kind of think, God, do you know what we're going through to protect your rights, to protect your safety and privacy? And I mean, I think the thing that still shocks me is the idea of consent. It's just gone. You know, if you at one time I was in a loo and this bloke tried to come in, and it was really small little. It was at a station. Spent my whole life at stations, and so there's just me and a woman with a trolley and a couple of toddlers, and this bloke tried to come in. He said, "I want to use the hand thing. It's broken in there, the hand dryer." And I said, "No, no, you can't. It's a women's toilet." And he so sort of held the door, and he was pushing it to get in. And in the end, he went off. Then I went into the loo, and he just came in and did it. And I just thought, what's happened to no? What? And he said, "I can do what I like now. I can, you know, this isn't a women's toilet. I can do what I want." And like consent has completely dissolved, and we're all saying no to this. Who cares? You know, I don't know. I mean, the other day I was thinking, who is the actual enemy in this? Because actually, the trans lobby, they're not very visible, really, are they? They're not. They don't feel to me to be very organised or particularly visible. Or it's a tiny minority of people. It's, you know, we know there's hardly any trans people, even if it exists as a thing. You know, whatever it is, it's just such a small group of people. Who is the actual opposition? And the opposition is the government. You know, is institutions, is the civil service, is, you know, most people are quite cowardly actually, and that's another thing that surprised me. I mean, that's what's so amazing when I go to events and things on this issue, and there's so many women that we're all so, you know, we're so brave. you you know, I was at Sara Morrison's hearing in Belfast. It's just great, you know, all these women doing this work. So important. One of the best things that happened was I told you that a member of staff recorded that fateful meeting at work, and I didn't know about it. After I'd gone through the tribunal, and I think about a year later, maybe it was a year later, uh, I met this woman, and she turned out to be the aunt of the person who had recorded the meeting. And she said, I was the one that told her to record it because when she told me about it, I knew it was going to kick off. And so I advised her to record it. And I was like, you know, that woman, that secret turfy aunt, um, basically, she won the case for me. She won. She helped to win the first case after Forstater, you know. And it just made me think, oh, these little ripples, you know, the sisterhood, basically. That's what I'm talking about. The sisterhood in action. And it wasn't nasty. It wasn't like, you know, bullying or anything like, you know. I think we've got a long way to go. I really do. I think, yeah, in the arts, there's a whole generation's going to have to move through it. I mean, at the minute, you know, my generation, sort of cultural leaders are going to be retiring. This next wave of um, ideologues are going to take over the arts. I think the arts is going to become very entrenched. I mean, I went to a conference recently at Watershed in Bristol, and I just thought it was insane. Like, the things people were just rattling on about white supremacists. We were all white supremacists. It was just crazy. It was so ideology based. I wrote it up actually, but yeah, I think the arts has got a really long way to go. So I mean, what I think, you know, it'll shift. Fashion will change. The arts is very fashionable, isn't it? It's very clique. It's very network. It's what's what's working, what isn't. I think the Arts Council's review in England, anyway, has had will change their funding streams, and that will change the arts to a degree. but I think it's going to take a whole generation to get through this bit. I mean, I went to Tramway the other day, and they've still got their toilets with urinals, toilets without urinals. And my husband said, "Well, what's wrong with that? At least they're separate." And I said, "But what they're saying is anyone can go in. The social contract's finished. They will not stop a man going into a woman's toilet. That's what that sign is. That's what it says. Anyone can use it. It's not a male and female toilet. That means I'm not as safe as I would be if I was in a female toilet." You know. So I mean, they will fight tooth and nail. Well, first of all, one piece of advice is humour can go a long way. You know, I used to, when I was following Maya's hearing, and I know who was it who had the dog, the safety dog or whatever it was, and those ridiculous things. And yeah, sometimes I would just talk about that in work. People would go like, but it was just funny. So I think humour can go some way to kind of diffusing things a bit. But the key thing for me was I was in a strong position to do it. My children had grown up and had moved on. Um, Financially, I wasn't in too much of a fix. We just paid off the mortgage, and so I felt I could do it. I could take that jump, and I think people do have to think realistically about how much risk it is to them. Um, but on the other hand, if you don't do it, you are repressing yourself. You're closing yourself down, and I think it also drives you mad. And I also think it's getting a little bit easier. That the fact there's so much media coverage, now that and that the media seems to be correcting itself a little bit more, so people can at least start to talk about these issues. You know, I definitely think the Darlington nurses. That's every case goes a long way, doesn't it? Every event helps. I mean, I think about people, like the women that run Glasgow Women's Library. How far they've like lost their principles, how far they've gone for men. I wonder what that's like. I wonder what they're like. I mean, I wonder what that's like to kind of to let that institution go down so badly. I think. I mean, I sort of still struggle with how are we going to all live together. You know, and there will always be trans people in the arts. It's just one of those sectors, isn't it? And in every profession, but particularly in the arts, I think. Um, and I do. I think we've got to accept that, you know. But I just need to just keep to. That doesn't mean I'm going to lose our rights. That doesn't mean that you can't have single sex spaces. You can't define what a woman is. Everything that comes from that. Um, so I still kind of struggle with quite how can we get to a place where we can just accept each other. You know, I think if you've got a Glasgow Women's Library, it's for women. If you want a Glasgow library, it's for everyone. you know, that's sort of the distinction. I've always tried to see politics or society through actually what's the impact of this on women. I think about that a lot. I mean, actually, my husband's just bought an electric car. God knows why, actually, because I think he just wanted a new gadget. But anyway, we went off to get it. You have to charge it every 2 minutes. Like those charging stations. If you went there at night as a woman, they're really dangerous. There's nobody around. they're partially lit. It's not like a gas station or a petrol station. And it's that sort of thing where I've looked at and thought, nobody's thought that women drive, and they're just putting these charges everywhere. So I tend to see things through a female perspective. How's this going to affect me and kids? And obviously, because I actually don't drive, I spend my whole life on the train. So transport policy and feminism are my thing. And quite often they align. Yeah. Yeah, I've always been a feminist. I mean, my background is my dad's Egyptian. I was brought up in Egypt. I was brought up Muslim, and you know, I know what repression is. I don't want to surrender my rights. I don't want to surrender women's rights. I know that women don't have rights in other countries and what that means. I mean, I remember one time I was in a meeting with colleagues, about 20 colleagues, and the boss of the meeting, this woman was ranting on, and she was going, there's racists in this organisation, there's TERFs in this organisation, they shouldn't be working here. And I left the meeting and I complained to the boss and said, you can't have that kind of political hostility going on in a meeting. I mean, my team was visual arts, God's sake. It's like you can't have the workplace descending into just this political sniping. I'm quite proud that we've set up freedom in the arts. I think I know. We're up and rolling. We are trading now, and that wasn't the plan. Do you know what I mean? I'd often thought, what am I going to do when I leave Arts Council? I need to do something, but this wasn't what I'd planned to do. Set up this organisation, and how influential we've become actually quite quickly. So yeah, I'm proud of that. No, I think it's just the journey, this long journey. And when people say, oh, you're obsessed with it, you think, well, actually, it has massively changed my life. And I'm just so proud of women in this movement. Whenever I go to anything, I just think it's amazing that it is a movement, and that I'm actually also quite proud that I've sort of become apolitical. I'm not party political anymore. When I was always so left wing and so Labour, now I feel like I can actually listen to what both sides are saying instead of just taking a tribal left wing side. I can kind of think, actually, how does that work? So I'm proud of that as well. I think that's. I don't know if everybody would. I don't know what exactly I'd call it, but I think I've actually become more open minded.
You've been listening to Unsilenced Project.